first we want to help everyone get to know you. So what do you like to do in your free time, if you have any?
When I do have free time, I like to spend time with family. I have 5 kids, so we have a pretty full house. Most of them have moved on, but we just had a real big wedding at the house, so that was a lot of fun. Also like to bike ride and lift weights, that kind of thing.
So we noticed that you have a lot of Star Wars memorabilia in your office. What do you think brought on your love for Star Wars?
I think it was about the only movie that my mom and stepfather took us to when we were kids, and that came out in 1977, so that sounds like a really long time ago for you all, I know, but I remember seeing the first Star Wars movie, which was Episode 6, A New Hope, in a movie theater, and it was just a good memory as a kid.
What would you say is the last book you read?
The last book I read was The 4 Agreements. I'm also reading a series. I like to listen to books in my car. I've got a half-hour commute, so I listen to books in the car, and I've been listening to a series called Otherworld right now, which is kind of a science fiction kind of thing, so it's similar to Ready Player One. And before that, I read, or I'm still reading Leadership 101. I'm about halfway through that one, and a couple other ones. I always keep a book handy just about everywhere.
So first up, what do you think some of your long-term goals are as superintendent, and what would you consider to make this your success?
I think, when we talk about short-term success, we have to have a successful day tomorrow. Tomorrow's the first day back to school. You guys will edit this, and we'll probably be a week or 2 in by the time you air it. But, if we can get everybody back to school and help them with that transition back to school, I think that's a great short-term goal. A lot of students are feeling anxious and some anxiety about returning back. And so we want to help them with that transition. We want to restore a sense of community. So I know a lot of high schools and elementary schools, middle schools are doing community building right tomorrow and the next day to kind of get teachers and students excited to be back and be back to be a part of that community. And then long-term goals, we want to make sure that we are addressing potential learning loss that occurred during the pandemic. Distance learning was tough for a lot of students, so we want to help them make up and get to where society says they should be, right? We don't believe that students are broken as a result of the pandemic or are behind, but there are certain benchmarks that we'll have to help them make up and reach over the next 3 years. And then longer term goals, I think I would like to see Loudoun County Public Schools enter into a time of enhancement. So we are a very large school division. We've grown by leaps and bounds by like 60,000 students in the last 25 years. We continue to grow in the last 10 years. The census tells us we've grown by 35%. So we continue to be one of the fastest growing county in Virginia and one of the fastest growing in the nation. And we've done a really good job with keeping up with that growth. So we have new schools open when they're supposed to be open. We populate those new schools. We have schools construction planned out for the next 10 years or so. But one of the things that we don't have and we haven't kept up with is enhancing our programs. So like for you all at the high school level, that could mean different interest and career academies at different high schools around the county. So you may, if you have an interest in a health science or the medical profession, at some day in the future you may be able to go to an academy, a school within a school, at another high school that would study health sciences and prepare you for a career in health sciences. Similarly, journalism may be one on there, or communications. And then also things like vocational construction, auto mechanics, things that will prepare students for life outside of high school. So enhancements. At the middle school level, that might be a fine arts academy. At the elementary level, that might be a language immersion program. But just enhancing the programs that are already there rather than just focusing on growth and building schools, really building out our programs and enhancing our programs so that we are offering an excellent education to all students.
All right, so moving on to the topic of, COVID and schools opening up again, since we are sitting down with the first day, as you said, just about 17 hours away. What happens to a student who has to quarantine?
So a lot of that depends on a couple of things. So it depends on the age of a student, it depends on the vaccine status of a student, and it depends if students are wearing masks. Because the definition of a close contact, which is what determines whether you have to quarantine or not, changes with each one of those. So for high school students who are totally vaccinated, and I'm hoping that you all are, they don't, and if they're a close contact with somebody who is COVID positive, and they remain asymptomatic, so they don't have any signs of being sick, then they don't have to quarantine at all. They can continue on just like life was in general. If students are not vaccinated and they are both wearing masks, so the person who is sick and the person who is exposed are both wearing masks, and they're separated by 3 feet of distance, and then they don't have to quarantine. Just the person who is sick would have to quarantine, but the other person would not have to if they were both wearing masks. Now, if one of those students doesn't have a mask on and they are closer than 6 feet and they're exposed, then they would have to quarantine if they're not vaccinated.
In terms of how people would receive their education, would it be available to them online? Or otherwise, what would that look like?
So it will be available online, but it won't look like it did last year. So we're going to continue using Schoology. I know that's the favorite thing of students everywhere. Teachers are still required to use Schoology, so all of your work will be available to you. You'll just complete that asynchronously with the rest of the class, and then your teachers will check in with you regularly during the time that you're absent for COVID.
What if an entire class, like an elementary school or middle school, who can't be vaccinated? What would happen if they had to quarantine?
So if we had to quarantine an entire class, then that entire class would switch to distance learning. So in that case, it would look a lot like we did last year, with the main difference being last year when we were in distance learning, sometimes we didn't know when we were coming back. This year we'll know that those distance learning opportunities or instances will only happen for a very short period of time. So the quarantine period is 14 days, so that's about 2.5 school weeks, maybe 2, depending on when it starts. So those students would be quarantined and receive distance learning just for that quarantine period, and then they would go back to school.
What type of resources are available for parents and students in terms of our plan of action if an entire school has to go remote?
So all of that information would be given out, messaged by the principal generally. And for high schools, I don't foresee, unless the situation changes a whole lot, because a lot of our high school students and a lot of our faculty are vaccinated, I don't think we'll see many instances or any instances of high schools having to shut down and have the entire school go distance learning. At least that's what my great hope is. And I think our mitigation strategies at the elementary and middle school level are pretty strong and should prevent us from having to shut down entire schools. But if we were at that point, what we would do is notice the families that were affected, so only that school would be notified. And then again, it would be for just that short period of time, as long as it needed to be to stop the spread, and then those students would be right back in the classroom.
Is there any discussion of those over 12 having to disclose to LCPS their vaccination status?
There is not for students at this time. As you may know, vaccines for students are mandated by the state, by the Commonwealth of Virginia. So it would be difficult for us to add any additional mandates to that beyond what is required.
How does LCPS determine if a case of COVID originated at the school?
So that's really hard to do, but what we do is through the process called contract tracing, which we're all familiar with now. Let's say that you came in, God forbid, but you came into school and you called us the next day because you were home and said, hey, I was COVID positive. And then we would go into the classroom and we would, at that point, we would probably ask who was vaccinated, but not require students to let us know. And those students who were vaccinated probably wouldn't have to quarantine. But let's say somebody sitting next to you or an elbow partner or a project partner came down with COVID within the next 10 days, then we would likely attribute that to a school transmission event. So we would know that you were sick, and then we would know that the person you were a close contact with got sick, and so that would be a transmission event that happened during school.
So what else do you think is important to know just about the school return amidst COVID?
I think as far as COVID goes, the most important thing is to follow the mitigation. So students and staff really need to wear their mask. They need to stay as far apart from one another as possible. We're hoping that's going to be about 3 feet. We know there'll be some places in the building where 3 feet may not be feasible, but stay as far apart as possible. The other thing is to make sure you're washing your hands and practicing respiratory etiquette, coughing into your elbow and that kind of thing. The schools are going to be cleaning high-touch surfaces throughout the day, so that was in place last year and was really successful. That's going to stay in place. We also have HEPA filters in every classroom across the school division, and we know that increasing that air circulation and filtering that air helps curb the transmission. But I think the biggest thing that students and families can do is stay home when you're sick. So if you're not feeling well and you can't attribute it to allergies or a known condition, and you suspect it might be COVID, that's really when you need to stay home.
So now we're going to move on to the more heated topic of school board meetings. As critical race theory and the policy 80/40 have been generating quite a lot of ferocity across the county. We've essentially become the face of the nation's culture wars on the news. So how do you plan to be a leader in this kind of environment?
I've said many times I'm just going to continue to do the right thing for students. And what the right thing for students is to provide and create a welcoming, safe, affirming, and challenging environment for everybody, regardless of gender, regardless of orientation, regardless of gender expression or race or ethnicity or any of these things that people try to use to divide us. We just want to be welcoming and safe and affirming for everybody. So my focus will continue to remain on students and to focus on student voice. And I have always relied on student voice to guide me in this area. So last school year, my student advisory committee and also a governor's roundtable that happened in Loudoun County, students were telling me, hey, we experience racial division and decisive things and uncomfortable situations on an almost daily basis. And we need adults around us to do better on that. So that was one thing. And then just this last month, as 80/40, which is of course the policy that protects the rights of transgender and gender expansive students, was being debated in the school board room. We had 2 school board representatives on the school board who spoke very eloquently about the importance of transgender rights and how that they knew people who were transgender, who were ostracized, bullied, and made to feel as unwelcome in the schools. And they expressed their opinion that this was the right thing to do for students, even though they were not transgender students. So keeping our focus on students and providing that best environment that we can.
All right, so there has been a lot about critical race theory in the news. Plain and simple, does LCPS teach critical race theory to students?
No, not at all.
So given your background as a formal social studies teacher, what do you really think our teachers should be teaching in regards to the history of this country?
I think we should teach an accurate history that shows both the good and the bad things that happened in our past. We know when Columbus came here that resulted in the deaths of millions of Native Americans. We can't gloss over that as we teach history. We know that shortly after Columbus came and the original founding settlers on the Mayflower, we know that shortly thereafter slavery was brought over, and we can't gloss over that. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about slavery not in the abstract, but in the very real sense that it disrupted and destroyed lives of West African peoples and people groups. So it's not that white people went and took slaves from the west coast of Africa. White people went and enslaved doctors and lawyers and fathers and mothers and chiefs and healers and hunters and farmers. And these were the people that were enslaved. They weren't slaves that just happened to move locations. These were families and real people that were disrupted. And I think we need to be very honest as we talk about that.
Ultimately, how do you think the concept of race should be taught in schools?
I think it should be talked about honestly, that we should have tough conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable. That when people experience racial bias, that they should, the schools should be a safe enough place that we can talk through that and that we can work through that and that we can ask for understanding and try to understand other people groups other than what we grew up in or what we're familiar with. And we should be able to have honest conversations and learn from one another. And I think as we learn from one another and learn about other cultures other than our own, we become more accepting and we can meet people where they're at rather than trying to change people.
So parents in Loudoun County have been especially vocal and slightly upset, especially about critical race theory and transgender rights. What do you think? What do you recall hearing from students on these issues specifically?
Well, on critical race theory, which I don't really use that term, but when I talk to students about race and racial bias in schools, they talk about situations in which they either saw or witnessed or were part of hurtful episodes. So the couple of examples that come up are, sometimes more subtle than just out and out blatant racism. Things like where students will change what they bring for lunch because they bring a food that's part of their traditional lunch fare or part of their menu at home, and somebody will say, that really stinks, don't bring that again. And then they feel pressured not to experience that part, not to live out that part of their culture. So they change in order to, rather than being accepted, they feel that they have to change. So I think that's what students say when they talk about race. And as far as transgender students, or the rights of transgender and gender expansive students, most students tell me that, one, they believe that transgender students deserve the same rights that they as cisgendered students receive. And then for a lot of students your age, I have found that really transgender issues that adults fight about are not so much an issue in the schools. I've run across only a few students who have an issue with transgender students using the bathroom that they identify with. Very few, and the great majority of students really don't have an opinion on it, and they just want to use the bathroom too. And so I found that a lot of students have really no opinion and don't really understand. Not that they have no opinion, because they believe that transgender rights should be protected. So that's not really what I wanted to say, but they don't understand the controversy of it, because many students just believe that everybody should be the right to express their true self, and that includes transgender students.
What do you plan to institute in terms of teachers who do not follow policy 8040?
So just like teachers, not just teachers, but every employee, no matter where you work, whether you work for Loudoun County Public Schools or you work for McDonald's, you're expected to follow the policies of your employer. And so every case is different, every case is investigated individually, but we will take action if teachers refuse to follow the policy.
What would you tell people about Loudoun County beyond the news coverage of confrontational school board meetings?
I would say that Loudoun County is a great place to live, and it is a great school system. That it's unfortunate that, and there's a lot of reasons for it, but it's really unfortunate that Loudoun County is singled out in the news so often. I think I read somewhere that Fox News gave us from March to June or something, I forget what the dates were, but over 4.5 hours of coverage were devoted to Loudoun County Public Schools. And that's unfortunate, because this really is a great school system. We have a lot of successes that simply aren't getting covered. Freedom High School, every senior that started at Freedom High School last year on day one graduated on time with nobody left behind. I've been in education for 30 years. As a high school teacher for most of that, I have never heard of another class where everybody who started on the first day graduated on the last day. And that's something that we should be talking about. our students are doing great things in the news. We have students that are inventing apps to screen for melanoma. We have students who are creating nonprofits that are helping their neighbors. We have great things going on, and one of the highest graduation rates overall in the state, some of the highest test scores in the state. So we're doing a really good job, and I think that's getting missed.
How do you feel about us coining the phrase "getting ziggy with it" as taken from Will Smith's "getting jiggy with it"?
Do whatever you need to do. That sounds good to me.
Is there anything else that students should know?
Just make this the best year ever. You all have been home for a long time, so take this time to celebrate, enjoy your teachers, enjoy school. I hope that students won't take school for granted anymore and complain about getting up in the morning, because we know it can be lost. And so just cherish this time, do your best work, and enjoy your back to school.
All right, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we can come back about halfway through the year to get an update on how everything's going.
Absolutely, anytime.